We're talking during Advent about God's gifts for you. We are busy buying gifts for each other and preparing for Christmas in the way that we usually do. And sometimes we don't stop and think about the gifts that God has given us. Last week, we talked about the gift of purpose. This week, we're talking about the gift of strength. Now, hopefully you will take me seriously in spite of my sophisticated attire today. It's good to have some fun, is it not? Yeah, it is. So, we're talking about strengths. Here's what we need to know about God's strength. The first thing is that He's a powerful God. We often say that He's omnipotent, which means all-powerful. That is the God that we worship, all-powerful. But here's the awesome and amazing thing about God. He is also an empowering God. An empowering God. In other words, we worship a God who actually shares His strength, shares His power. Can you imagine? Now think about people who are in really powerful positions in our world. Most people who are in really powerful positions are spending an awful lot of time trying to protect that power, right? They're not sharing it. They want to keep it all for themselves, and they want to gather even more power as they continue to wield their power. No, they're not going to share that power. The power is all for them. We have a God who is all-powerful and who shares His power with us. We're in Psalm 29 today. It begins this way. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. When King David wrote this psalm, he was used to seeing thunderstorms that rolled in off of the sea and over the desert. Now, if you have ever seen an oncoming storm in the desert, it's kind of interesting. It's not hidden by any trees. It's not hidden by any hills. You can see that storm coming miles and miles away. You can have a clear sky over you, and on the horizon, you'll see clouds. You'll maybe hear long delayed thunder. You'll see lightning occurring way off in the distance. That's the kind of storm that David was talking about, King David. That storm that rolls in off of the waters and rolls in over the desert. So the voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. I don't know if any of those cedars are left, but in Jesus' time, or certainly in King David's time, these trees were amazing to behold. They were 30 feet, not in diameter, but across, 30 feet. Huge, something that we've only seen if we go west and look at the redwoods or something like that. Huge, huge trees. These trees are of a very strong wood, and no one could even imagine destroying one of these trees or exploding it into kindling. But that's what David says about the voice of the Lord. It's that powerful, it's that majestic that it would break the cedars into pieces. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, Mount Sirion like a young wild ox. Mount Sirion is a 9,000-foot mountain. God's voice is so powerful, David is saying, that it makes that mountain quiver and shake as if it were small. And finally, the voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. So I did a little research on lightning. Lightning bolts have up to 100 million volts in them. One big lightning bolt can contain as much as 13 million horsepower in one lightning bolt. When a lightning bolt strikes, it's hotter than the surface of the sun, if you can imagine. And the final fact that I have about lightning here is that at any time in the world, there are about 1,800 thunderstorms occurring all the time, somewhere in the world. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning, even greater than any of that. The voice of the Lord shakes the desert. The Lord shakes the desert of Kadesh. Kadesh is in the south, and Sirion is in the north. So what King David is saying is that God's voice carries across the entire land. For them, almost the entire known world, right? That God's voice was that big, it carries over all of it. The voice of the Lord twists the oaks and strips the forests bare. I don't know if you remember Mount St. Helens explosion. It was a really powerful explosion. It was described as being equivalent to 500 atomic bombs. There were 230 square miles of destruction that had all been trees when that explosion occurred, and millions of trees were destroyed in the explosion of Mount St. Helens. They said that enough trees had been destroyed that 300,000 homes could have been built. The voice of the Lord is more powerful even than that. And in his temple all cry glory. Now here we are. King David has taken a lot of time and a lot of care to describe how powerful the voice of the Lord is. And then he goes on to say, when we hear that voice, what's going to happen? Every one of us, we're all going to fall to our knees and cry, glory. But then an amazing thing happens. The Lord gives strength to his people. The Lord blesses his people with peace. The Lord gives strength to his people. The Lord blesses his people with peace. God shares his power. He wants to equip and empower you also. He gives us peace. Even when we're panicking, we can have the peace of God. He gives us endurance when we're empty and run down. He gives us courage when we're afraid. It's that kind of strength that God passes on to us, a bit of his own strength. This is 2 Timothy 1:7. For God does not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline. He doesn't expect Christians to be timid. You know, that's one of the things that people, one of the reasons that they don't want to be a Christian, because they feel like they have to be a walking mat, you know, and allow everybody to walk all over them. That's not the Christianity that God has prescribed for us. He doesn't expect us to have a spirit of timidness, timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline. So there's 3 areas in my life where I need the strength of God, and I'm guessing you do too. To get us through what we can't get through on our own. The first one is to get us through what we can't get through on our own. Most of us have been in a situation where we realize we aren't powerful enough to do it by ourselves, don't we? And once in a while, we're even smart enough to cry out to God and say, I can't do this, Lord. I'm incapable of doing this. I need you. Before I knew Christ, I was involved in the church. In fact, I grew up in the church. I was always involved in church, pretty much all of my life. One of the things that kept me involved in church was music. I've told people over and over that music kept me in the church long enough that I finally found Christ. For me, that music usually amounted to singing. And I was singing in the church as a child, and as a young adult, I was always singing in the church. I was probably in my late 20s or early 30s, somewhere in there, one day, and I was sitting outside the sanctuary during the service, waiting to go in because I was supposed to sing a solo. Now, I'd been singing in the church for decades by now, and the one thing I knew about my singing was it was always awful. I made a mistake every time I sang. Every time I sang. There were no exceptions. I would go in, I would forget lyrics, I would lose my place, I would be off tune, I would miss the tempo, I would miss an entrance. Something went wrong every single time I sang in the church. It was so frustrating, I got to the point where I wasn't sure I wanted to sing in the church anymore. It was too much. So I'm sitting outside the sanctuary this random Sunday, waiting to go into the service because I'm supposed to sing. And this novel idea occurred to me. Maybe I should say a prayer. Yeah. And it did. I said, Lord, I've tried for a long time and I can't do this on my own. I'm not capable. I've tried and I just can't do it. And I asked for some help. Now, there's an interesting thing about praying when you don't really know Christ. God almost always answers those prayers. Why? Because He wants you to know Him. He wants you to see that He's really there. He wants to see that somehow He makes a difference in your life. And I went in there and I sang a song as perfectly as I've ever sung it in my life. It's crazy. How could that possibly be? Just from saying a simple prayer. Sometimes we get in a situation where we know we can't do it on our own. It's one of those areas where God gives us His strength. The second one is to avoid doing what we know we shouldn't do. To avoid doing what we know we shouldn't do. I'd been a pastor maybe a total of 6 weeks in my first church ever. In fact, the first Sunday morning I was there, I'm greeting people as they come in, and somebody calls out from the pew, "Oh, Pastor," and I looked around for him. I didn't have any idea who they were talking to. Oh, wait, that's me. That's how new a pastor I was. 6 weeks afterwards, the chair of the trustees of that particular church came up to me, And I was greeting people after the service, shaking hands and saying hi and what have you. And he came up to me and he puts his nose about that far from my nose and screams at me at the top of his lungs. Every hair on the back of my neck just went up like that. I had an immediate, fight or flight response. I had plenty of choice words for him. And somehow, it's almost a miracle. I've been known once in a while to lose my temper. Just occasionally, just occasionally. Somehow, in the midst of that really stressful situation, I stayed calm. Now, I can tell you it wasn't me. It wasn't me. I had no idea what this guy was yelling at me about. It was out of the blue. It made no sense whatsoever. And later, he apologized to me because he had heard something that I had supposedly done or supposedly said which hadn't happened at all. It was all a huge mistake. But if I had responded the way I had in many other of those situations, I'd have just made it worse. Sometimes God gives us strength so that we don't do what we know we shouldn't do. And the third one, so the first one was, he gives us strength when we can't get through it on our own. He gives us strength when we know to avoid doing what we know we shouldn't do. And the final one is, he gives us strength to do what we know we should do. To do what we know we should do. In the late 90s, I had been a pastor only for a year or two. Mid-90s, I suppose, more like. Been a pastor only a year or two, and my brother-in-law was scheduled to have gallbladder surgery. My sister's husband. Now, Chuck and I didn't have anything in common, we didn't fight or anything like that, but I had no reason to be spending time with Chuck. And yet he was going into surgery the next day, and I knew I needed to go visit him. He was in the hospital. I needed to go visit him. It was a 2-hour drive each way. It was a beautiful day. I could think of hundreds of other things I'd rather do than that. I didn't want to go, and yet somehow I managed to find myself in the car. I managed to find myself driving up to the hospital to see Chuck. We talked a while. I prayed with him. I held his hand, and I left. When Chuck went into surgery the next day, they discovered his body was entirely full of cancer. It wasn't a gallbladder problem after all. Now, Chuck died about 10 days later. He left my sister with 4 little boys. Yeah. And I was sitting by his bed, holding his hand when he died. Now, sometimes God gives you strength so that you do what you know you should do. Okay, now all of that was just an introduction to a 5-point sermon. But hey, I fixed you lunch, so we're good, right? Yeah. So let's go through these. If I could see my notes here, we'll go through them. These are the 5 steps to receiving God's strength. The first one is affirm God's power and presence. 1 Chronicles 16, 11 through 12. Look to the Lord and his strength. Seek his face always. Remember the wonders he has done, his miracles, and the judgments he has pronounced. We're supposed to remember the stories. We're supposed to see how God came through for his people. It's important that we affirm God's power and presence. That's how King David began Psalm 29, wasn't it? Affirming God's power and presence. You maybe remember a song that Bette Midler sang. I don't know if she wrote it or not, but the song was, God is watching you from a distance. Do you remember that song? Some of you are old enough to remember it. Yeah, that isn't how it works. That is not how it works. That is one of those examples of really bad secular theology. No. God is not watching us from a distance. God is with us. He is here now. He is everywhere. When we're getting into trouble, he's there. When we're being righteous, he's there. When we're making good decisions, he's there. When we're making bad decisions, he's there. When we're alone and lonely, he's there. When we're having family together and a wonderful time and building memories, he's there. He is not watching us from a distance. No voyeur God, I can assure you. We are to affirm God's power and presence. The second one is admit your own weakness. This is 2 Corinthians 12:9. But the Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Now think about that. If we never admit any of our own weakness, then God's power isn't present in us. Because, listen to the words, my power is made perfect in weakness. The only way we really get to experience God's power is through our own weakness. Admit you're weak. We're weak. We're really weak. Some days I'm terribly weak. It goes on to say, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. Affirm God's power, admit your own weakness, and the third one is align yourself with God's will. John 15:5, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit, for you can do nothing without me. Now here's the hard part. How do you align yourself with God's will? The first thing is you need to know God's will, don't you? And folks, there's really only one way to know God's will. You have to know God. That's the only way. It's the only way. It begins with accepting Christ as your Lord and Savior. And once you know him, you will know his will, and you will follow his will. Number 4, ask God for the strength that you need. James 4:2 makes it really, really clear you do not have because you do not ask God. Simple as that. When you pray for strength, when you pray to a God that you know for strength, your prayer will be answered. I guarantee it. Your prayer will be answered. If you want God's strength, ask. Ask. And we have a few intercessors in the congregation, people who have seen answers to prayer. Doreen is one of them. one of our intercessors. Well, we're borrowing her, but yeah, borrowing. Intercessors are prayer warriors who actually see answers to their prayers and see them on a regular basis. Do you journal your answers? No? Yeah. Some intercessors journal their answers. I don't either. I always get a kick, though, because you forget, how many answers to prayer you've seen. And when you see an intercessor's prayer book and they've got answers to prayers and answers to prayers and answers, you just go, oh my goodness. Wow. It's powerful. Ask if you want God's strength. And here's the last one. Act right out of obedience to God. Act right out of obedience to God. Even when you don't feel empowered, do what you know you are supposed to do. It's really simple. I've got a little clip here that I'd like to play for you. It's been around a while. Some of you may have heard this before, but I hadn't heard it for a while. I hadn't listened to it. And when I listened to it again, it got me just the way it did the first time.
Hey, Mike, can I talk to you?
You bet, Logan. What's up?
I want to tell you something that God just told me.
Okay.
Last night, my dad was roping this calf. And this calf had been born from a really old cow. She didn't have really the greatest milk. She didn't have, like, the vitamin C and stuff.
Okay.
She broke her back. And this morning I went out and put her down myself. I was talking to God. I was asking God why she was special. And God said, you know, Logan, but my son was special, but he died for a purpose. It's kind of the same thing. That calf was close to me, and God's son was close to him.
Logan, you're so right. It's true. Think you're gonna be okay?
Yeah, I'll be fine. But I wanted to tell you guys that is so important. Just remember, when you lose a loved one or a pet, always remember that God gave his son too, and he understands. He will always understand. He will always just run to him.
Logan, you're wiser than you know, buddy.
Oh, I just figured I'd better call and share with you guys. Love you.
Love you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
"13 years old. Called a Christian radio station to say that. Even when we don't feel empowered by God, when we take action by obediently proceeding down the road that God wants us to walk, he will give us strength, the strength that we need for the occasion. God bless.